Hello, historians. This is Mrs. Tyler. Today we are doing Notes 1 from Unit 1. This is Becoming a Nation. This is inside your notes packet. And as we go through, you'll notice some blanks to fill in your notes packet for this set of notes. And so as we go through, when you need to write something, it will appear on the screen. Okay, let's get started. We talked today in class about how throughout the 15 and 1600s, European countries were kind of racing and competing to establish colonies all over the globe. They would send their explorers out to different continents and they would discover or claim some of these land masses for their own countries. That way, they could access some of the natural resources and that would help make their country more powerful and more wealthy. Natural resources all over the world, like access to spices from Asia and India, access to diamond mines and gold and silver in other parts of the country or in other parts of the globe. So all of these wealthy European countries, England, France, Spain, Portugal, they had all started this race to colonize other parts of the world. England, France, and Spain had all laid claims to different areas of North America. Spain had built, in the 1500s, had built a fort down in St. Augustine, Florida. France and England had established the fur trade up in the northern part of North America. So there we see a French and a British ship arriving. The first successful permanent colonial settlement was the British settlement of Jamestown in 1607. You may remember the story of Pocahontas and John Smith. We talked about in class how it was completely different from the Disney adaptation of that story, but still kind of fun to watch that version. The reality was that that colony or that settlement almost didn't even make it. Most of the people that first winter died off. There were less than half of the settlers left by the spring of the following year. A new shipment of people and supplies returned in 1608. And one of the people that joined the settlement was a man named John Rolfe, and he brought with him some tobacco seeds, and he planted those tobacco seeds, and that actually saved the settlement of Jamestown. The tobacco was highly valuable. They could trade it. People all across Europe wanted to smoke that kind of tobacco, and so it actually brought in a lot of cash. We call that a cash crop. It brought in a lot of cash for that settlement and helped the settlement gain stability, and they were able to grow from there. Over the course of 150 years, 13 British colonies were established. We know that in 1620, the Pilgrims arrived up here in Plymouth, Massachusetts. But the year before they came in 1619, that was when the first ship that brought people from Africa to North America. They had arrived then. Okay, so over the course of 150 years, 13 British colonies had been established along the east coast of North America. France and England fought the French and Indian War to decide who would claim even more land beyond these 13 colonies. These areas right here, this was all about the fur trade, and you talked about that a little bit in 6th grade as well. All right. As those colonies grew and developed, we kind of started to notice that each of the regions had economic and cultural differences. A lot of it had to do with the climate as well. So we talked about how the New England colonies, they were religious communities. These are our Pilgrims, our Puritans. They had come for religious freedom from Great Britain, and they practiced subsistence farming, which that should be a flashback to 5th grade, talking about how you grow and just enough food to feed your family. You're not growing extra to sell or make money off of. This is just for your family's survival. The reason that was a big deal up in the New England colonies was because that's a cold region. The ground was frozen for half the year. It was very rocky soil. So it wasn't very conducive to growing big, lots and lots of crops. They also did a lot of whaling and fishing because they were on the coast. They participated in the fur trade and were hunters. There were a lot of forests, so they cut down trees and made lumber and sold that as an export and a finished product. They also started shipbuilding industries. Okay, the next region is the middle colonies. These are the colonies that it's a little bit warmer, not quite as frigid. The soil was much better for farming. So these had larger farms. A lot of these farmers grew grains that they used to make cereals and breads. So this region gets the nickname of the breadbasket colonies. They had larger cities. There were also ports along the ocean so that ships could come and go for trading. So there were a lot of merchants who owned their own ships, and people would lease those out, or they would also just carry goods back and forth to Europe and sell those. Larger cities developed because of these trading ports, like New York City. Philadelphia became a large city. There were a more variety of religions practiced in these colonies. Up in the New England colonies, it was mainly those Pilgrims and Puritans. But down here, we've got Quakers in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. They were very a peace-loving and tolerant group of people. We have Catholics and Protestants, all kinds of different groups. Okay, and lastly, we have the southern colonies. Most of these are made up of plantations, which were huge. We're talking 150 plus acres, and that's a lot of land. But this region also was much warmer. The soil was really nice and fertile. It was not as rocky. It was perfect for growing things like tobacco, like we talked about with John Rolfe and that Jamestown colony. But when you're growing that large of a number of products and goods and cash crops, we didn't have machines that helped us to plant and harvest and reap all those crops. So the unfortunate reality is that many of those plantation owners began to participate in the slave trade. And that was something that had been going on for many, many years. Spain and Portugal specifically had really brought that and made that kind of a booming business by trading all kinds of manufactured products, guns, weapons, things like that, with African tribes in exchange for human beings. And those people were then shipped across the ocean to the Caribbean, to South America, and then into North America for the southern colonies to use on plantations. They were growing cash crops. You don't grow cash crops to eat. You grow cash crops to sell. So those are things like cotton and tobacco. Okay, so we have three distinct regions. Those plantations also, those southern colonies didn't have a whole lot of big cities. I think the largest city at the time was Charleston, South Carolina, but the people were very spread out, and those plantations were very self-sufficient. People made what they needed to make to function as a functioning plantation. They specialized in that kind of stuff. They were also usually located along wide rivers, and each of the plantations typically had its own dock. So a ship could come in, a boat would come in and unload goods that had been ordered, or they could take away the crops that they had harvested to go sell at the market. So it's kind of like they didn't really need to leave much. There wasn't a whole lot of purpose for having big cities. They didn't go to the big cities as frequently. They just, they were pretty self-sufficient, and they did a lot of their trading right from their plantations where they had those docks along the rivers. Okay. We talked about how France and England had fought the French and Indian War to decide who was going to continue to expand further westward into the wilderness and that. So, but that's really expensive. So King George III decided, these colonists should start to help me pay for these costs of fighting this war and gaining this land. Many colonists didn't agree that that was their responsibility. They knew that they were not allowed to send any representatives to the British Parliament that helped write the laws and set up the taxes. But whatever that Parliament decided and whatever the king decided, they were forced to live with, and they had to obey those laws, and they had to pay those taxes, even though they had no say in the government. So tensions began to rise between American colonies and England and the British king and Parliament. So then we see events like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. Those are things that you guys talked about as fifth graders way back. Okay, so you're going to write down the King of England and his colonies tax the colonists. The colonists ultimately rebel against him. All right. This is where people like Ben Franklin come into play. He suggests that, each of these little 13 colonies are not very scary and not very intimidating to a big, powerful king. But we would be stronger and have a bigger voice if we united together and spoke up for our rights. Okay, so he's the one who suggested that. The colonists decided to send representatives to form a Congress that met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They decided to talk about how they should respond to King George III's abuse of power. In April of 1775, the king ordered British troops to go in and disarm or confiscate or take away all the colonists' weapons so they couldn't fight back. And so that's the story that you probably remember from 5th grade of Paul Revere and others riding around, leaving Boston on horseback and riding out to warn the people of Lexington and Concord that the British were coming to take their weapons. And that was, so the militia came out, and the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired on Lexington Green the morning of April 19th, 1775. So once we have shots fired, we have a war going on, right? And so we can't just fight that war with just a couple little militias. We're going to need an actual army. And so we chose the Continental Army to be led by George Washington. He had been a soldier in the British Army during the French and Indian War, so he kind of had some background knowledge about how England fought wars and how they trained their military. Okay, and we also had to decide, what are we fighting for? So they debated the pros and cons of completely breaking away from England. And in July of 1776, they decided to draft a letter to King George III to formally declare the 13 colonies were independent from Britain. They asked Thomas Jefferson to be the person to write this down. He worked with a group of others to kind of formally decide how it was going to be all written out. The Declaration of Independence is really a breakup letter. It's a list of all the crimes that Thomas Jefferson and others felt the king had committed against the colonies. So these are the main things. They didn't feel like the king was caring about the rights of colonists. They really resented being taxed without any form of representation in Parliament. Britain also kept sending those red coat soldiers, and instead of providing for those soldiers, they passed a law called the Quartering Act that forced all of the colonists to house soldiers in their homes. They felt that was a pretty big invasion of their privacy. And lastly, the king tried to take away the citizens' weapons so they couldn't fight back, and they felt that was pretty unfair. So in 1776, on the timeline on your page, please write down that that's when the Declaration of Independence was written and signed. There's a video I will link from YouTube, but here is those 10 I got. Hard to see down there, but that's okay. Some colonists argue that it's our duty to obey the king. They believed that God had granted the king power and authority to govern. But this is a different era. This group of people were a part of a new group of thinkers called the Enlightenment thinkers. And so they started to think a lot differently about what it means to have rights. Natural rights was the belief that all men are created equal. And of course, at the beginning, they only really were thinking about this in terms of white landowners being equal to the king and that not having a monarchy or a king in control. Unalienable rights are rights that are given by the creator. And so if they aren't given by a government, they can't be taken away by any government. And that means it's really the government's job to just protect people's rights. That's the purpose of a government. And they felt the king was not doing that. So that leaves us with fighting the Revolutionary War. It was fought between Great Britain and the American colonies. It was fought from 1775 to 1783. And even though the Continental Army lacked training and adequate weapons and basic supplies and sometimes food, and they didn't have the money to pay the soldiers sometimes, George Washington had strong leadership, We ended up getting support from France, who was also enemies with Britain, and we were miraculously able to defeat Britain. We won our independence, Britain lost, and those 13 colonies became the United States. Once that happens, though, now we got rid of our old government, and it's going to be time to create a new one, and we'll continue talking about that soon. Have a great day. Bye.